want to say greetings in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. And, during this very difficult time, I want to say that how much I appreciate all my pastors and friends being on this webinar today. We got a really interesting things we're going to talk about today. It's going to be really interesting. We're just honored to have Bishop Bernard with us. It's going to be a great time of just connecting and just, seeing each, talking to each other. And so we're looking forward to that. I want to say, for the last 32 years, I've been pastoring 32 years in Atlanta, and this has been one of the most challenging times in my pastoring years, and dealing with the pandemic situation has just turned everything upside down. And so, we all in this thing together, and we thank God for it. This is for our section. I pastor in Atlanta. I'm also the principal of Section 5, which is the Metro Atlanta area, and this webinar is for our Section 5, but we invited people from all over, some from Canada. So thank you for joining us. For those who are in my section, thank you for being a part, and those in different parts of the nation, thank you for being a part today. I just want to say that, of course, the feeling of isolation and separation from our brethren has been very challenging. It really has. Not seeing my friends, talking to my friends, but I want to say that I'm really excited about connecting with you tonight and sharing some things with you tonight, that we're connecting as a body, as colleagues, we're connecting. But I just want to say, last week we had Brian Kinsey last week, and he did an awesome job. He talked about opportunities for the church, what the church can do during this time, and there's a silver lining in this whole ordeal about the pandemic, and we just got to look for the opportunity. And I do feel like the glass is not half empty, but the glass is half full. So we're very thankful for that. Well, Bishop, I want to thank you for joining us today. I really appreciate it. We have right now 30 people on our webinar right now. Of course, we have about 75 people registered. But I just want to say, number one, to everyone that's joined us today, thank you for joining us as we talk about, fear, faith, and common sense, and of course, all talking about reopening the church. I was saying earlier, the last few weeks has been very challenging as a pastor. I've been pastoring for 32 years in Atlanta, and trying to navigate through this pandemic has been very challenging and really overwhelming for all of us. It's been challenging, walking through an empty building. I'm so used to having live worship and hugging people, shaking people's hands, and now it's totally different. And one of the things, the church is empty. One man said the church is not really empty, but the church is really deployed. It's implored into the harvest field. And so we know that that's to be true. And I know for some pastors, it's been maybe challenging for you. We've been trying to scramble. The first week I was scrambling, trying to figure out what to do, and it's just really challenging. So I just want to say that, this is an opportunity for us to kind of come online and kind of, just talk a little bit. We've all been isolated and separated from each other during this time. Last week I mentioned to you, we had Brian Kinsey last week. Brian Kinsey talked about, opportunities. Where it's a silver lining in all of this. I do believe that God is speaking to the church. I do believe that God is plastered all over the news, all in the newspaper, all the radio. It's called coronavirus. And I feel like God is really speaking to the church, and what an opportunity for the church to take advantage of this opportunity. I do believe that the glass is not half empty, but the glass is half full. So I really appreciate that. And of course, throughout history, in every crisis, there's always risen an organization or an individual to really help manage the challenges. And so, Bishop, again, I just want to thank you for being on the webinar. This is our General Superintendent of the United Pentecostal Church, and we definitely appreciate him and his taking the time out to join us today as we talk about, faith, fear, and common sense and reopen the church. Bishop, I think one of the things that's concerning now is that, this kind of caught all of us by surprise, and there's a new norm that's coming out now. Things are going to change, and as apostolic people, we're so used to connecting. We're so used to hugging necks, laying hands on people, and praying with people. The question I'm asking today, how do we manage all this now? Because it's going to be a new norm for the church.
Yes, and I think, some states are starting to say we can have church again. but they are also saying we need strict social distancing. So I think what we have to do, in fact, I'm going to be sending out a news bulletin tomorrow, an email news bulletin. So everybody that's on the mailing list will get it. And if you're not on it, you can go to the UPCI website and sign up. And we also have a Facebook page for UPCI ministers called Forward. I'll put it on there. But I think what we're going to have to do is educate our church, post some written guidelines, and some of the practical things that they're saying that families people that are living together can sit together, but otherwise there should be distancing of 6 feet, which will limit the size of your crowd. So you may need to have a couple of services. You may want to ask seniors to stay at home and watch online. Maybe 65 and older or something like that. You may not want to resume children's classes just yet. And of course, you should have hand sanitizer everywhere. After each service, you should do a deep cleaning and especially clean all surfaces that hands touch. And you probably shouldn't pass offering plates, but have an offering box or some other alternative. So there are lists of about 20 things you could do. And I think, and of course, no handshaking and hugging. So you're going to have to create some alternative. So maybe a wave or an air hug. And I think what happens is if the pastor enunciates that gives permission for people to do that. I know when this was first breaking out, I was in Canada. And so I started doing elbow bumps. And one of the ladies said, well, you can shake my hand. You're not going to get coronavirus. So she was kind of offended. So I had to say, well, it's the principle. We all have to do it. We can't try to pick and choose who we think is infected. Everybody has to do it. So, that's the challenge we face. But I think if the church puts some things in writing, if the pastor talks about some things from the pulpit, then that's gonna help create a new norm where we can understand how to do these things. And I know another problem is laying on of hands, but I'll give you a testimony. Several months ago, I was preaching in a women's prison in Texas, and it was very strict control. And since we had a mixed group from the church, but since they would not allow, especially any man, to touch any woman. So when I gave the altar call, many of these women flocked up to the front for prayer, but I was not allowed to touch them. So I had to stand a couple of feet away and just pray over them, putting my hands in the air. And so did the other men. And nevertheless, we had about a dozen receive the Holy Ghost. So I do know it's possible. We just have to change our own thinking. We can still do what we normally do, but it has to be with social distancing.
Well, this is going to be a new norm for us because we're just so used to, as apostolics, praying, laying hands on people. The Bible talks about laying hands on people. So, how do we deal with the fear factor? Because now people are very cognizant of who they're next to and, looking at the next person that's coughing at the church. So how do we deal with the fear factor as a pastor?
Well, first of all, I think we can make some reassuring statements. So just the things that I've mentioned, I believe we ought to communicate. Here's what the church is doing. So you can talk about your cleaning schedule. You can talk about your protocols. You can talk about social distancing. And that will reassure some people. I think you could also say if you are a senior, we recommend you stay home for the first couple of weeks. Let's see how this goes. If you have a compromised immune system, if you recently been weak, or if you just have, a fear that you could be highly at risk, then we understand. We give you permission to stay home. You can look online, and we'll stay in touch with you. So I think a combination of communication and giving permission for people to make choices if they're afraid, but at the same time, you have to project a statement of faith. And I think probably in a few weeks, depending on how things go, then people's fears will be allayed.
Well, I think that the thing about fear is that you've been talking about moving from faith you know,
Yes.
and that is one of the major things that people are really concerned about. It. We're talking about reopening the church as a pastor. When would a pastors know? Because like some states are already open now, like Georgia, our governor has given us permission to come back to church, but people are not coming back to church. So
Yes.
how do a pastor know when it's the start or the time to start bringing people back to church?
Well, I do think, first of all, you check with your state, but you also might check with your county or city to see what guidelines they have. And if you read carefully, some of them are saying with strict social distancing. But when you go through the items, which I mentioned a few, and as I said, I'll be sending the full list out tomorrow, you may say, well, at this stage, it's just not practical. Yes, theoretically, I can do it. And if I only had 10 people in my church, fine. But I can't accommodate 300 people like this. And what about the restrooms? Either we have to close down the restrooms or we have to have a strict policy of only a few people at a time, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We have to have monitors in the hall. So, considering all the 20 things that have to be done, maybe as a practical matter, it's premature. I also think a pastor should have a leadership team and consult them, because they will reflect the thinking of the congregation. If the pastor just unilaterally makes the decision, it might be premature as far as the psychology of the congregation. I'm not talking about living in fear, but I am talking about people that are really concerned that they're at risk, plus people are concerned that all of these measures are so strict that they're not attainable. And so the church may say, in theory, we're doing social distancing, but in practice, it's just not going to come to pass. So I think maybe it should be a collective decision where the pastor would guide it, but he would have a group of trusted people to help him decide when is the right time to open.
One of the things that we did, we put together a team of a health professional team to really come in and help us to figure out what's the best thing to do. And so that's been really helpful for us, because what it did was it brought buy-in to the congregation, because now they feel like, well, pastor is concerned. He just wants to just open the building up, but he's really concerned about the health of people. Exactly. And I think when we did that, it really helped people to understand what pastor is really thinking about this. And so by having the health professionals on board, it really kind of helped calm some of the nerves. So again, I think as a pastor, you have to kind of figure out where your people are, I would assume, what's happening in your community. And of course, when those guidelines comes available, utilize those guidelines. But I think the main thing is that, of course, we've been having drive-through church and things like that. But the thing is that people just don't want to come. We don't know anything about the virus. We don't know everything that's about it's going to reoccur, be another surge, and people are really concerned about the surge that may happen later on. And so people are kind of like, I'm not going to come right now. I'm going to stay home. I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to stay home. So I think that the main thing for me, Bishop, is really preaching faith.
Yes.
But yet using wisdom at the same time.
Yeah. Well, I think one thing is we've got to contact these people personally. So ideally the pastor, and if you've got a fairly large church, you might have a pastoral team, but actually calling each one or checking with them on social media and reassuring them. And then, as I said, communicating the procedures that you're doing, the safety measures that you're taking. Then another thing is a phased in approach. So what you can say for the next 2 weeks, we only have capacity. So let's say your building will seat 300. You might say, we only have capacity for 100. So we're asking you to sign up. I know this is strange and this is weird, but we can't accommodate everybody. So it makes sense that those who are seniors, those that are high risk, those that have small children where we can't really accommodate them right now in the nursery, or those have other reasons, then maybe you should wait a couple of weeks. But those who can, go ahead and sign up so that we know we make room for those who can. So that gives you another thing, that people that are fearful, whether justifiably or not so, they've got a couple of weeks. It starts phasing in. And so you plant the seed that now, in a few weeks, we'll be able to accommodate everyone, but it will be based on results. It'll be based on seeing the pandemic decline in our area, seeing that there are no real problems at our church. So those of you who feel like it's premature, you don't have to be in the first group. You can let others who are not at risk significantly to be at the first group. So that way you're giving them permission, but you're not catering to fear. It's a legitimate issue because you can't accommodate everybody. And I think maybe that could be a way of easing people back in by phasing it over the next 4 weeks.
Oh, that's good. That's good, Bishop. During this pandemic, people talk about fear and things of that nature, but I feel that there's a silver lining somewhere in this whole ordeal. I feel like there's an opportunity for the church. From your perspective, what do you feel like the opportunities are for the church during this time?
Well, I feel like there are definite opportunities, and this is a force of nature. It's happened before in human history. It's unusual to us, but it's a fact of life. And whatever the cause and whatever role the devil is playing, I'm sure he's trying to discourage and destroy and put despair in the hearts of people. But here's the good thing. Whatever the devil means for evil, God can turn around for good, as in Genesis 50. So no matter what's going on, yes, this surprised us, but it didn't surprise God. We didn't have a plan 6 months ago, but God had a plan 6 months ago. So definitely we ought to be asking, what is God going to do in this? The first thing I see is that our church is being exposed to many people who've never come in the doors before. Many people are hearing the full gospel, have never heard it. People who don't even know about Pentecost, people who are reluctant to come because of tradition or inconvenience or whatever, they're able to come in and online. And I believe even the casual surfer, God can touch their heart. So who knows how many people we've probably already touched, and it may have been just 5 minutes, but we probably touched twice as many people as who have ever come into our church. I mean, that's got to be a good thing. That's seed being sown. There's a law of averages or numbers that we're going to reap a harvest from some of those. 1,000 views may only distill to one person who ends up coming, but that's one person we wouldn't have had before. So that's a positive thing. Second thing, it has forced us to be more conscientious in reaching out to each individual. And it's easy for a church that's successful, it's fairly large, just to kind of coast on the services. And we need and want the services, but people can fall between the cracks. And so I think a lot of pastors are being very diligent to check on the new converts, the elderly, the vulnerable, those that are weak in the faith, those that are struggling, those who are fearful. And they're calling them. They're calling every single one. They're reaching out because, and then we're forced to be having services in homes. Maybe in some cases we're having small groups, but if not, at least families are having family devotions. Kids are getting the Holy Ghost in the home. So it's forcing the church to be more intentional in one-on-one outreach, in home, emphasizing the home, emphasizing small groups. And if our church hasn't been doing that very much, that's something that after all this recedes, we can still do a better job of that and not neglect that. And then a third thing is one pastor can't do all this unless it's a very small church. So it's forcing the pastor to call on faithful saints. And it's forcing, I say forcing, but it's showing that the saints, the mature saints and the leadership and the other ministers, we've got to support our pastor. We have to work as a team. There's no way we're going to keep connected to everybody if we don't have a large number of faithful saints doing their part. And that's another thing I hope that once this recedes, we don't just go back to business as usual and say, okay, let the pastor take care of everything. No, it's each person assuming their role in the body of Christ. And that can help transform our church culture. And I even see this on a general level that, as Pentecostals, we have a very independent streak, you might say, self-governing and self-reliant. And that's good in many ways. But something like this shows us the value of organization, shows us the value of our neighboring pastor, the value of unity. I think we're reaching out more to one another. So there's less rivalry. There's this less feeling of, I don't need you. I don't need the UPCI. And we're saying, no, I'm glad I have an organization that's standing with me. I'm glad that we're binding together, making decisions collectively, and getting some good direction of how to handle these situations. I think a lot of pastors are feeling, I'm not so confident that just by myself I can handle all this. I want to know my organization is standing with me, and I want my people to know that I'm accountable to a large group of ministers that are working through this together. So I see some great benefits coming out of this.
Well, I also feel like, number one, is pastors, forcing pastors to trust their leaders.
Yes.
That's probably the biggest thing. And of course, developing leaders and so they can help facilitate the revival. One of the things that we've done, Brother Bishop, we've been calling our guests. We went back all the way back to 17. And you'd be amazed the response that we're getting from guests. Well, thank you for checking on us. We hadn't been in your church in a long time, but you know what? We're coming back. And the response has been very well because we're just kind of checking on, hey, if everything's okay, you need anything, what can we do? You need prayer, whatever. And it's been really, really great for us. So I think it's an opportunity for outreach like never before because, like you said earlier, we're so comfortable being in the four walls. And one man said the church is not empty. The church has been deployed into the harvest field. It's been out there. Now people are doing Bible studies. They're having prayer meetings with their neighbors, their friends. They're doing online stuff. And of course, it's challenging people to be more creative more than ever before. So yes. I feel like that's kind of one of the silver linings in there. Now, there was a pastor there in Louisiana who defied the law. He opened up his church, okay? And he had church services, okay? Of course, we know the First Amendment gives us freedom of religion. We understand that. But the question I want to ask you is, does the government have the right to close or shut down a church?
Well, first of all, let's look at it legally, and then we can look at it morally and practically. We do have the First Amendment, which gives the freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, freedom of press, freedom of speech. So just to say absolutely the church, can the government close down the church? The answer is no. However, the government sometimes has a compelling interest in some things. And one of those things is health and safety. So does the government have the right to regulate public meetings and public buildings for health and safety? And the answer is clearly yes. That's why we have building codes, health codes, fire codes, and you just try that. You just try having church by violating the fire code, they'll shut you down. They do have a right to do that. But here's the key. It must be a compelling interest, which health and safety would be. I think a pandemic would be. The government cannot discriminate against churches. So if it's letting movie theaters open but closing churches, or it's letting people come in the parking lot to go shopping, but not letting people come in the parking lot to have a parking lot service, then that's wrong. The government cannot do that. And there has been some government overreach, and I've helped to push back, and some of our district superintendents have worked to push back on that. The third thing is it has to be the least restrictive means. So if medical science says, well, it would be safe to do it under the following conditions, then that's what you should do. The government can't just jump to the harshest means of dealing with the problem if there are less restrictive means that would cover that. And so I think now that's why you're seeing government starting to relax the rules, because it seems like the intensity of the crisis may be passing. And so less restrictive means, while none are perfect, are possible. So I don't think, as I said, some local governments have overreached, some state governments have. I don't know it's as much anti-religious bias as they're more so secular minded, they don't even understand the needs of religious people or value church. So there could be some anti-religious bias, but really the cause of all these regulations is not anti-religious bias. It's the intention is not to take away religious freedom. So I don't think that's the paradigm by which we should see this. if the federal government announced we're shutting down all churches, or we're forcing all churches to sell their buildings, or we're confiscating their buildings, or we're limiting all churches to once a week or to 10 people, regardless of the medical situation. Obviously, we're going to fight that vigorously. But under the current circumstances, I believe the government is trying to address a legitimate medical crisis. So we should respond in kind. We have rights, but with rights are always responsibilities. So we should be asking not only what are our rights, but we should be asking what are our responsibilities. And if their request is reasonable, then we should abide by it, because we are supposed to be good citizens. We are supposed to submit to government according to Romans 13 and 1 Peter 2, especially when the government is trying to do what is their legitimate job. We should respect them. So that would be like if you're speeding to a church service, the policeman stops you and gives you a ticket. You say, I have a First Amendment right to preach. I'm going to speed away. And you break away from the officer and go down the street. I mean, that's not really exercising your freedom of religion. That's disobeying the law. And so if you do feel like the government is infringing too much, well, as law-abiding citizens, we are in a democracy. We're not in a dictatorship where we might have to do this in secret, but we can talk to these officials, and I think in a respectful way, and saying, why are you requiring this of us but not of this other business? Or why are you restricting us when there's perfectly good medical reasons for us to be able to do some things? And so you start with discussion. You start with your local community, because you want to have a good relationship. And even if you say, look, I'm going to trust God, I feel like God has told me he's going to protect me. But what about the vulnerable in your church? And what about the vulnerable in the community? It only takes one outbreak in one church to spread it to the whole community. So are you willing to say, I'll risk my life? Okay, fine. I'll risk my family's life. Okay, fine. But are you willing to risk the unsaved community members' lives? And will they appreciate the fact that you're going to have faith for them and put them at risk? Or is that going to destroy your Christian witness? And the Bible does have some examples. The devil told Jesus, hey, the Psalms promises that God is going to protect you lest you dash your foot against a stone. So jump off the temple. And Jesus says, no, I'm not going to tempt the Lord my God. You're not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to deliberately put yourself in harm's way unnecessarily. Now, if God calls you to go somewhere, and even though at a risk, you do it. But if there are other ways, and I think at least in the short term, we've had many other ways to still accomplish the mission of the church. The mission of the church is not restricted to big meetings in large buildings. The first century church typically didn't have big meetings in large buildings. So you can't say this one way of having church is so absolute that I cannot consider any other ways, even if it's in the best interest of the community. At least in the short term, I think there's a lot of flexibility.
Well, I think one of the things is the church testimony in the community.
Certainly.
To me, that's probably the biggest thing when you say bishop.
Yes, exactly. And we should be good citizens in the community. We are our brother's keeper.
Wow. One man said we've gone from the mega church to the micro church.
Yes.
When you say that this is kind of like going back to the book of Acts.
Yes. And now let me be clear. I'm not against the big building and the large service. Here in Austin, we built the building that initially seats 1,000, and it's internally expandable to 2,500. And we built our congregation to about 1,000. So I'm not opposed to that method. It's very effective. But if you want to say religious freedom, and you're infringing on my religious freedom, well, wait just a minute. Did Jesus say you had to meet with 1,000 people, or it's not valid? If you have to meet in groups of 10, could you still worship? And the answer, of course, is yes. The first century did that. And in some ways, that's more effective. I personally think we can have the best of both worlds. And maybe we've gotten unbalanced by focusing too much on the big picture and neglecting the small picture. And so maybe this pandemic can help us get a balance, not to eliminate the big picture, but to add back the small group setting, the home devotions, the Bible studies, the small group meetings during the week, the one-on-one checking on people, and saints ministering to saints. And so that's why if you just talk about, well, this is an infringement of my religious freedom, first of all, you have a very narrow view of how the church can do ministry. And second of all, you may be missing God trying to show you some new things. And then we've already mentioned that seeming to have a rebellious attitude toward government or disrespect for your own community and bad public relations with the people you're trying to influence. Now that's not to say we shouldn't stand up for our rights. I do believe that if our rights are truly being infringed, we should stand up for them. But I think we could do so firmly but kindly through proper channels. And then if they aren't responsive, we escalate. So there is a time to sue. There is a time to go to the media. But even then, I would want to do it in a very calm, cooperative, and considerate manner.
Okay. Another question, actually, of course, let's say that we reopen the church, and of course, a pastor has to consider, when he should open up. And we talked about the criteria earlier of things that he needs to do. But let's say that he opens the church up, and someone comes in and gets the virus. Can a church be sued because of that?
Well, there is always that possibility. So I guess the bigger question is, can the church win, or can the person win? So first of all, I think there is an effort on state levels to pass legislation to protect businesses from taking reasonable steps to open, but you can't eliminate all risk. And you can't eliminate the fact, well, you don't know for sure where somebody gets it. So I do think it would be helpful if there is some legislation that would protect churches along with other establishments. But in the absence of that, what I would suggest is if you for sure follow what your state or locality guidelines, number one. Number two, you have, a protocol that you follow, that you've advertised, and you're open and upfront about that. Number three, another thing you could do is contact your insurance company and say, what do you recommend? Because insurance companies, if you have property insurance, there'll be general liability coverage. They will usually say, what happens if we get sued? You're going to defend us. What are your criteria? That could be another outlet. So then once you do that, you've done all the things that a reasonable person could do. That still doesn't prevent someone from suing, but it increases greatly your ability to prevail because you're saying, we did what any reasonable person would do. And when you walked in here, you assumed the risk. We were very upfront in saying, there is a pandemic, here's our response to it. So if you didn't feel that was adequate, you didn't have to come to our church. So I think we could prevail. But if we just do nothing and open the church, I do think there's a high risk because people might say, well, a reasonable church would be taking precautions. And I just assumed that you were a reasonable church. I just assumed you did all the cleaning and everything the government required or asked. So when I came to your service, I just, trusted you. But if you didn't do those things and they got coronavirus, there is a risk. But if you do all those things, then your answer would be, well, we took all the precautions that a reasonable church would take. We followed the advice of our government. We followed medical advice. We have a medical team here, a team of leaders. They came up with this. They compiled it from all these sources. We checked with our insurance company. So we did everything a reasonable person could do. So if you got it anyway, well, we can't prevent you from driving on our parking lot and get accidentally hit by a car. We could take reasonable steps to prevent that, but we can't eliminate that possibility altogether. And then I think you would prevail in a lawsuit.
Well, we had a conference call with our insurance company on Friday about that. And of course, he said anybody can sue you, no matter. The problem is where they win. That's what he was saying to us.
Yes,
and
that's what I just did too. Yeah.
He said, as long as we're following procedures and we have guidelines, we're posted guidelines, we've done everything we know to do. We of course, now we're taking temperatures and things like that. But as long as we're following the guidelines, we're doing what's required, we post those things, people know it. He said, we can't guarantee anything, but he said that as long as you're doing the proper things, he said that's not a problem whatsoever.
Now, let me add to. So what the takeaway is, you should have procedures that are based on these sources. Okay, that's the first part. But the second part is very important. If you have those policies and procedures, you have to follow them. So when you make up your policies, if you have a list of 20 things and 5 things you don't really intend to do, but it sounds good, that's a big mistake, because what will happen in a lawsuit is the lawyer will say, so you knew you were supposed to do all these things. By your own admission, you knew that was the right thing. And you, in effect, promised to do them, but then you didn't know what you yourself knew was you were supposed to do. So the only thing worse than having no policy is having a policy and not follow it. So whatever policy you come up with, you have to follow it.
One of the questions that came up here says, would we need documentation of our procedures for proof?
Oh, yes, I think that would be highly advisable. But you want to do that anyway. I mean, you want to publicize this. You want to put this, probably post it on the bulletin board. You probably want to put it on your Facebook page, or you probably want to put a page on your website so everybody that comes knows. I mean, that's part of reassuring people that it's safe to come and that we're a reasonable church and we're taking all precautions. And then, yes, secondarily, and so people will follow it. So all your staff knows exactly what's expected of them. There's no guesswork. If it's just oral, orders, there's a high risk that somebody is not going to follow through. But if you put it in writing and so forth, the first purpose is to make sure you do it. But then the second purpose, of course, is to document in case of a dispute.
Oh, thank you. One of my last question, but we got about maybe a few more minutes here. The government signed a $2.2 trillion stimulus bill just recently, and they also signed another one this past Friday. And of course, do the church qualify for the PPP loan? And is there any repercussions if you do get the loan?
Yes, certainly churches qualify, and we did have dialogue back and forth with governmental officials until that was clarified. And in fact, the Small Business Administration added some regulations to specifically say churches would qualify and they would not have to give up their religious freedom to do so. So it's no question that churches qualify. Many, many churches have gotten it already. Of course, you might, from ethical point of view, if you can't really document harm, maybe you shouldn't get it. Maybe you should save it for businesses in your community that are being harmed. But if you can document there's likely to be harm or there has been harm, then it's for you. Now, the question of repercussions, some have raised red flags by saying, okay, once the government gets involved, they can start regulating. That is a risk and that is a danger. However, under the current circumstances, I don't think so. There's not much, because the government has been so clear and so explicit in putting these statements in place. And there is a well-settled law, and I'm more familiar with this because dealing with Urshan College, Urshan Graduate School of Theology, our students qualify for federal financial aid. And one of the legal ramifications of that is, even though the money goes to the students, still it involves the school, and so the government has regulations. So they have regulations about employment and non-discrimination, which we're happy to follow because we believe in it ourselves. Of course, one of the things that was put in the non-discriminatory portions was you can't discriminate on the basis of sex. Now, when that law was passed, the meaning was clear. You can't discriminate on the basis of male and female. Under the Obama administration, there was an attempt not to change the law, but to redefine the terminology of the law through regulations to try to include homosexuality, transgenderism, and so on. Under the Trump administration, they have abandoned that. So there is an effort to try to redefine the law and then in that way come in the back door. But I don't think that's going to be of a direct effect first of all, because the Trump administration has been very clearly against that. Of course, there's a potential change of administrations next year, but by that time, these loans should be converted into grants if you meet the qualifications. And I think it'd be very difficult for a new administration or a new Congress to try to go back retroactively and change what was a promise. And then finally, I would say, even with that attempt at reinterpretation, the well-settled law is that churches can discriminate on the basis of their sincerely held religious beliefs in this area. For example, the Roman Catholic Church discriminates against women because it doesn't allow women to be priests. So that's even under the definition of sex as what it really is in the statute, male and female. But they're allowed to do that, and still their Catholic charities receive funding because they're not doing it out of animosity towards women. They're doing it because that's their doctrine for 1,000 years. Now, I happen to think that that's misguided, but the point is there is well-settled law that says churches, and they have an absolute right for discrimination in the choice of ministers, because you can just think of the problem. If you tried to sue a church because, you discriminated by not hiring the pastor, well, then the government would be telling you which pastor to hire. So there has to be, if there's going to be any religious freedom, the church has to have the absolute right to decide who's going to be a credentialed minister, who's going to be a pastor of a church. So there's well-settled law that protects the church. Could there be an attempt in the future to change that? I think under a different administration, absolutely there's going to be an attempt. I don't think it will affect this, but I think it's a battle we're going to probably have to fight sometime in the future.
Of course, we're talking about, financial things now. Of course, giving has, from some churches, been, has decreased.
Yes.
So would you recommend for a pastor, say a pastor is struggling, he has maybe a daycare center, or maybe just him and employees, would you recommend for him to apply for the PPP?
Yes. If he's got employees and the church income is down, that's exactly what this is designed for. Now, I will say this. The first round was depleted in 2 weeks. The second round just started today. So if you're seriously considering it, you need to talk to your lender and you need to get an application in tomorrow, because I imagine if you get too far behind, it's going to run out again. Yeah,
that's true. I know some people that's applied and they didn't get anything the first round because everything was gone.
Right.
Yeah, just like that. But let's talk about giving. Of course, it's really, people are used to putting money in the offering plate. Now that has totally changed. Most people are now trying to go online, either mail and in now. How do you see all this change in the dynamics financially for the church?
Well, it's very interesting because I've just conducted a series of meetings with our district superintendents, and the vast majority are reporting little or no effect. And if there is an effect, it might be 10%. Some are even saying there's been an increase in giving. Now, I suppose where it's really going to be an effect is two cases. One, where people are actually losing their jobs, church people. Obviously, that could have an effect. Hopefully, that's going to start swinging back here in May. The second thing would be if the church doesn't have online giving or their people aren't used to it. Some churches, already their culture is the majority of their people give online anyway. I do think this is a perfect opportunity both to get online and to train your people to be online, because even though there's a slight percentage that you have to pay, having that regular payment, and some people are even willing to set it up on a recurring basis. I mean, having that is so convenient, and people, once they set it up, they tend to keep their commitment. So in the long run, it's a very effective way for the church. So this is a great excuse, if you will, to train your church. Let's go to this. And once they go to it, chances are they'll remain on it. I guess for some churches that are not used to that, there could be some sort of reminders. You'd have to be diplomatic, of course, but there could be reminders to mail in their check or offer to come by once a week, or ask them to come by and have some kind of deposit box system to minimize this problem.
Well, I know giving is one of the most important things that we do, giving to missions, giving to different things,
Sure.
because I feel like, a lot of this, it's going to change all the dynamics when it comes to giving. Brother Norris, we get ready to close out today. Maybe there's some last things you want to say, or maybe things you feel like you want people to know.
I would simply say, and it's kind of been a theme already. First of all, we do need to pray and trust God. We need to make a personal connection. This is an excellent opportunity to challenge every saint. You need your own personal connection with God in your home, and your family needs devotions. But also, not only our focus should not be just on survival, protection, healing, supplying our needs, although obviously all those are legitimate and important, and we should pray and trust God. But I believe the second thing we need to do is look that God is wanting to do something new. Could this be an opportunity for change? Maybe painful change, but going online for the first time, or if you've had an online presence, expanding it, be more creative, using social media more effectively, connecting with saints more effectively, connecting with visitors more effectively, using small groups more effectively, or if you've never done them at all, do them. Something you'd mentioned earlier about contacting visitors. Our church, when I was pastor, every 6 months, we contacted the entire visitor list by phone. And of course, part of the thing we did was we could clean up the list of people that were no longer had valid addresses or phone numbers. But the real main reason was to let them know 6 months or a year later, we still care about you. And it's surprising the positive responses, because they expected the church to call them the next week or send them a letter, but they didn't expect to call 6 months later. And they might have visited half a dozen churches, but we were the only ones who would contact them 6 months or a year later. And then the first time they came, they might have had an interest, but they really weren't ready. But we contacted them a year later, something happened in their life. Now they're hungry for God. They wouldn't take the initiative, but when the church did, that was kind of the sign from God. I'm knocking on your door, or a sign this church really is interested. So that's a good practice. So anything this crisis is forcing us to do good practices, then it's worthwhile. So we should be looking for those things. In closing, that's what I'm saying. In addition to renewing and strengthening our connection with God, let's look at new things that God is trying to do in our church.
Wow, Bishop, this has been amazing tonight, and I've got so many comments on the list here, and people are just thanking you for your wisdom. We need this time, and we all been separated from each other, and everybody's kind of scrambling right now. I mean, really trying to figure out what to do and how to do it. And I feel like the only reason I started doing it is I started reaching out to men in my section and pastors in my section, and just started connecting with them, and felt like, hey, you know what, we need to do something. And so I just feel like I want to just thank you, Bishop, for just being on this call, and I want to thank everyone for participating and being on the call also. But also next week we have our district superintendent, Brother Darrell Johns, will be with us next week. He'll be talking about, should we reopen, and when should we reopen. He's going to talk about all of that. He will have some pros and cons about certain things, and I really appreciate our district superintendent, Brother Darrell John. He's a tremendous man. I appreciate him allowing us to have this webinar as part of what we do. And Bishop, again, I know you're a busy guy. Thank you so much for your time, and may God keep you and be safe. Okay.
I'm thankful for the opportunity. God bless you. Appreciate all of you, everything you're doing.
God bless you. Thank you, Bishop. Bye-bye.
All right. Goodbye.